Okay. Thanks everyone for coming along to this roundtable on Native American Studies. I've got two speakers today, Sarah Rivett from Princeton University and Pekka Hamalainen from Oxford University, and a commentary to follow from Dave Murray, who's an Emeritus Professor here at Nottingham. Each of them's going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then Dave will offer a response and some thoughts and some questions, and then we'll open it up for you to ask your questions and offer any thoughts that you might have, or criticisms such thing come to mind. I'll just introduce the speakers first, and then cede the floor and let them take over. Sarah is an Assistant Professor of English Literature at Princeton University. For this academic year, she's a Visiting Research Fellow at the Royal Military Institute in Oxford. Her first book, which came out with North Carolina in 2011, was called The Science of the Soul in Colonial New England, which won the Frank S. and Elizabeth Brewer Prize from American Society of Church History. She's published articles in William and Mary Quarterly, Early American Literature and American Literary History, and her present project is called The Savage Sounds of Indigenous Words, Religion, Enlightenment and American Literary History. Pekka Hamalainen is the Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford University. His first book was called The Comanche Empire, which was published with Yale University Press in 2011. It won the Bancroft Prize, the Merle Curti Award, the William P. Clements Prize, and quite a lot of others too. The list of prizes this book won is longer than my CV, actually. So, it's a successful book. He's published articles in Journal of American History, American Historical Review, William and Mary Quarterly, amongst others. And he's presently working on a book called The Shapes of Power: Frontiers, Borderlands, Middle Grounds, and Empires in North America, 1600 to 1900, which is coming out with Yale University Press in the future. Dave Murray, finally, Emeritus Professor here at Nottingham. I was fortunate to have a couple of years working with Dave whilst he was still in the department. He's the author of various books, including Forked Tongues, Speech, Writing, Representation, North American Indian Texts, which was published in 1991 with Indiana, Indian Giving, Economies of Power and Early Indian White Exchanges, which was published with the University of Massachusetts Press in 2000, and Matter, Magic and Spirit, Representing Indian and African American Belief, which was published with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2007. Two talks today. Sarah's is entitled The Indigenous Origins of American Literature. Pekka's is entitled In the Mainstream, The Uncertain Futures of Native American History. And with that, I shall hand over to Sarah.
Hi. I wanted to begin by thanking Matthew Pethers and also Bevan Sewell for inviting me to come and for orchestrating this event. I'm very happy to be here. Can you all hear me? Am I speaking loud enough? Okay, even in the back, good. So we were invited for this panel to reflect on the state of the field of Native American studies. And I'm going to do this by focusing on one aspect of this field, since it is so multivalent and cross-disciplinary. And the aspect I'm going to focus on is language. I'm going to talk specifically about language encounters between American Indians and Europeans from the colonial to the early national period of U.S. history. This is a topic that I feel has garnered a lot of interest lately, and it's also the subject of my current research, so it has the advantage of being something that I've thought a little bit about. And I also wanted to take advantage of the fact that David Murray is responding today, because his seminal work, Forked Tongues, Speech, Writing, and Representation in North American Indian Texts, is a book that I spent a lot of time with as a graduate student and had an influence on my project that I'm working on at the moment. In the second half of my talk, I'm going to do a kind of state of the field, and then in the second half of my talk, I'm going to do the thing on American literature that my title promises. So hang tight, it'll come. And does everyone have a handout or a neighbor with a handout that you can look on? Yes. All right, great. So scholars such as Jill Lepore, Walter Mignolo, and Stephen Greenblatt have amply established that Christianity disparaged and destroyed many indigenous tongues. The destructive forces of early modern colonization set into motion a process of linguistic decline that archaeologist Colin Renfrew describes as elite dominance, the most drastic form of rapid language loss. According to Ives Goddard, northeastern Algonquian was the language group most thoroughly destroyed through colonization. And you can see in the first figure on your chart, this is a chart from Goddard's article that shows the dates of extinction or the number of remaining speakers. But what does it mean to say that these languages are extinct or that they have been destroyed? What are we to make of the vast records of Iroquois and Eastern Algonquian left by Jesuit and Protestant missionaries? Collated vocabularies, dictionaries containing thousands of indigenous words, and grammars comprise an archive of European attempts to acquire knowledge of Native American languages. From this linguistic base came a massive translation project. Scripture, catechisms, psalms, Bibles, prayer books, and other Christian texts appeared in print and manuscript form in a variety of languages: Wampanoag, Mi'kmaq, Mohawk, Abenaki, Miami, Illinois, Delaware, and Mohican, just to name a few. A little more than a decade ago, Laura Murray identified the Indian vocabulary list as an elusive literary genre in an article in the American Quarterly. Her article evokes the contradictory facets of missionary linguistics. Indian tongues were not only erased, they were also preserved. How did erasure happen? Through the act of preservation. Scholars such as David Silverman, Glenda Goodman, Patrick Urban, John J. Steckley, Tracy Laval, and Linford Fisher have read these texts as productive of syncretic and cross-cultural exchanges. But yet, as other scholars have pointed out, translation also involved mistranslation, exposing irreconcilable differences. In the past decade, there's been a resurgence of interest in linguistic colonialism, translation studies, and cross-cultural communication between Europeans and native populations. This work builds on foundational studies by David Murray again, Laura Murray, Anthony Wallace, and Bernard Sheehan. Scholars of indigenous literacies include Matt Cohen, Christina Bross, and Hilary Wisp, Philip Round, and Brigitte Brander Rasmussen. And these scholars have challenged the traditional binary between oral and written cultures. Their work shows how European and Native peoples actively integrated indigenous science systems into the spread of Western literacy and its accompanying textual forms. So the question I want to pose is, why has the study of colonial language encounters become of such interest to scholars? And I'm going to suggest 3 answers, and then I'm going to tell you about its influence on American literature. 1, language offers a way to productively link ethnohistory and indigenous studies to Atlantic studies and intellectual history. This is in some sense an ongoing response to the call for an Indian Atlantic that was posed by Ian Steele in Reviews in American History in 1998. I'll say also that I did not do a works cited list to hand out as part of your material for this talk, but if you'd like my works cited list, you're welcome to email me and I'll send it to you if you're interested in this topic. Okay, so in Steele's article on the Amerindian Atlantic, 1998, the long-standing presumption of indigenous language death created something analogous to what Steele described as an outmoded anthropological perspective on disappearing American Indians. Our new critical focus on cross-cultural exchanges in indigenous language texts is an attempt to revise this perspective by linking the history of ideas to different forms of indigenous resistance and survival. So in place of a narrative of language death, we might ask instead, how did Indian languages transform the structure of European and Euro-American intellectual history? As Jesuit and Puritan missionaries struggled to map indigenous tongues to universal Christian truths, Algonquian and Iroquois resisted this form of translation through a syntax that sustained a completely different cosmology. As David Murray explains in his recent book, Matter, Magic, and Spirit, objects in indigenous belief systems had non-material power. Anthropologists Irving Hallowell and Mary Black have explained that in Ojibwe, for example, plants and animals can take animate as well as inanimate forms. This is represented linguistically. Verbs and nouns are conjugated or gendered to reflect whether the object is animate or inanimate. Animacy is a shifting phenomenon. Sometimes it's present in the object, sometimes it's not. So imagine the confusion of a 17th or 18th century missionary who believed that all of the world's population and nature were reducible to Christian truths, encountering the semiotic world for the first time. The indigenous cosmologies encoded in words forced missionaries to confront the reality of language as particular rather than universal, as bound to the logic of time and place. So another way of saying this is that they arrived at the insights that secular language philosophers would arrive at decades earlier. And this is ironic, of course, since they were trying to actually make the languages have a universal resonance, and they found out that they had a particular humanly constructed meaning. Point number 2 about why language. The study of indigenous languages and literacies transforms previous discourses of American Indian resistance into a social fact with an archive and a material history. So some of you might remember or be familiar with this debate in critical inquiry from the early 1990s between Myra Jalin and Peter Holm. The debate concerned the relationship between language and history, and whether it was possible, to quote Myra Jalin, to recover the agency of the colonized through English and Spanish colonial histories. Jalin comes down on the side of not really. The best we can do, she argues, is to look for, quote, non-proven narrative elements and textual ruptures that suggest the possibility of agency. In this method of reading, counter-narratives are necessarily indeterminate and uncertain, ultimately producing a less than satisfying result, an inability to penetrate the colonial script and access what she calls history before the fact. Indigenous language texts offer a way out of this bind. Translation gives the illusion of control through commensurate words and through the powers of communication that come about through translation. Yet all languages also resist translation. As Lawrence Venuti writes, language is, quote, a collective force, an assemblage of forms that constitute a semiotic regime. Venuti goes on to explain that these forms are positioned hierarchically, but that this ordering is subject to constant variation. Therefore, any language is a site of power relations. The act of translation itself can thus serve a disruptive force. In missionary communities, linguistic resistance resulted from the nexus between the contingent purposes of the translations, to study the languages, to communicate Christian doctrine, and to secure native allies during the imperial wars, and the historical actors involved, including indigenous interpreters, language instructors, and proselytes. So for example, which is figure 2 on your handout, a famous example is the 1663 printing of the Bible in Massachusetts, or Wampanoag, known as the Eliot Bible. So as a material object, this text has 2 lives. This edition is one of the first complete Bibles published in a non-Western tongue. Eliot's translation efforts aligned with those of his patrons in London's Royal Society to serve the evangelical purpose of propagating the Protestant ideal of sola scriptura. Presentation copies of the Eliot Bible were sent back to England with the hope of garnering more support for the mission. So the Eliot Bible represents a fantasy of a kind of linguistic control, but the efficacy of the translation depended on indigenous actors involved, whether they read it, whether they believed it, and whether they acted on it in terms that the ministers would have found doctrinally sound. Contextual evidence suggests that the reception was not quite as fixed as Eliot would have liked. The Massachusetts word for wind, for example, was wabin. Wabin was used to translate the passage from Ezekiel 37:9 through 10, which is that little text at the top of your figure 2. And in English it says, by prophesying to the wind came and the dry bones lived. And you can see the word wabin if you look closely. So this passage was known as a highly effective homiletic among Native audiences. It was a really good passage for inducing conversion. This was partly because there was an Indian preacher by the name of Wabin who famously converted many proselytes. So the way the Puritan ministers read this was typologically, by which I mean that there was an Old Testament type, and then that type foreshadowed the living person Wabin in the historical present. This is the way the Puritans understood providence unfolding in historical time. But the description of God breathing life into Ezekiel's dry bones also corresponds to the Wampanoag belief in Manit, which is the spirit power that can animate people and objects in the natural world. Waban attained Christian authority while also maintaining the power of the spirit healer within traditional indigenous systems of belief. And other examples of American Indians converting to Christianity while still holding on to their traditional beliefs abound, particularly if one reads the French Jesuit records. Not only did this multivalent meaning open up syncretic possibility, French Jesuit priests themselves were also fascinated by the animate and inanimate ontology of indigenous words. So the next item on your handout, figure 3, is a single page from a dictionary. The dictionary is primarily written by Jacques Gravier. It's Miami, Illinois to French. And it's a massive text. It's at the Watkinson Library in Hartford, Connecticut. It's 580 giant pages containing approximately 25,000 Miami, Illinois words. And it took him several decades and numerous collaborators to complete this project. The page you have on your handout offers a list of Illinois words pertaining to the spirit worlds. The kind of main part of the text is the word Manito, which is in Gravier's unique orthography. And it's translated in French into Esprit, Dieu, de la Neige, and Médecine. So Manito could mean snow, spirit, medical remedy, or God. The word Médecine referred to the shamanic doctors within the community that Gravier writes a lot about in his letters back to the Society of Jesus. The translation of Manito as snow registers the Illinois belief in animate elements within the natural world. So the dictionary records the connection between the indigenous spirit worlds and North American nature. The list beneath contains multiple variations of the word. Each variant has been altered through prefixes and suffixes that convey a range of meanings. It is God, it is not God, divine, he calls himself a spirit, I am not God, a spirit, and so on. So the word variants, with their constantly fluctuating meaning, represent a fluid cosmology. The word itself conveys the presence or absence of the spirit through an animate or inanimate ending. On the one hand, the dictionary serves its purpose as an instrument of empire. It records linguistic knowledge so that Gravier can communicate effectively with the local Illinois population to convert them and then secure their alliance with the French in the ongoing imperial wars. But the precision and breadth of the recorded words also undermines this purpose. Words recorded in Gravier's dictionary not only salvage Miami, Illinois language, religion, and culture, they also imported aspects of an indigenous cosmology into Jesuit consciousness. So this brings me to my third and final point about scholarship on language. I think that this work is in part a response to the increase of language revitalization programs. For example, the Miami Center in Oxford, Ohio recently received a grant to transcribe and translate the contents of Gravier's dictionary, as well as one other by his successor, Jean-Baptiste Le Boulanger. And the goal is to use linguistics to reverse language loss. So to actually bring the language back to life for the descendants of the people who originally spoke it. And this goal has already been realized in the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project that goes by the acronym WLRP, which began in 1993. And this is on figure 4 of your handout, the last figure before the quotes. So a Mashpee tribal member, Jessie Little Doe Bard, claims to have heard a sacred message and to have seen the faces of her ancestors in a dream that she had for 3 consecutive nights. She interpreted her dream as a sign that the ancient language of the Wampanoag tribe should be reclaimed because she felt that she heard this language in her dream. So she got a degree in linguistics from MIT, and she worked in collaboration with others to reconstruct Wampanoag from printed 17th century colonial records. It's actually very incredible. There's a documentary on this that you can find on the website if you're interested. You can see from the snapshot of the home page that there's a juxtaposition between Eliot's Bible, the first page of Genesis, and a contemporary statement about what it means to bring this language back to life. And what this juxtaposition suggests is that resurrecting a language from the past becomes a way of trying to heal the wounds of colonialism. So that language loss acts as a metonym for the destruction of identity, culture, and sovereignty. Yet, Maliseet scholar and linguistic anthropologist Bernard Perley points out these categories and their connection to language are themselves built upon Enlightenment assumptions. So to avoid the problem of essentialism, or of replicating the romantic, with a capital R, quest for an language, more work should be done to compare colonial indigenous language encounters to contemporary attempts at revitalization. We should think more about language as porous and malleable, as a record of fluid historical interactions rather than remnants of an all but forgotten past. Language wields the potential to expose the false binary of modernity as it has been constructed throughout US history and literature as a series of ruptures and changes set against a static Aboriginal past. By connecting colonial linguistics to its broader intellectual and literary context, we see that these languages were not simply lost or destroyed, but rather absorbed into the American literary imaginary. So here's my turn to literature. The genre of American literature is the origin story. Writers of European descent had to construct myths about where the American Indians came from in order to account for their relationship to the land and their projected disappearance. One myth was the Hebraic thesis, espoused primarily by missionaries who wished to place American Indians within Judeo-Christian history. Another myth came from Enlightenment thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Smith Barton and the Comte de Volney. These he was French, but these writers altogether, American and French, proposed a link between American Indians and Asia. Indigenous tongues were used in support of both theses. Eliot, Thomas Thorogood, and James Adair heard Hebrew resonance in Wampanoag and Chickasaw. Jefferson and Barton collected vocabularies with the hope of systematically mapping Asiatic connections, and they wanted this connection between American Indians and Asia to replace the Hebraic thesis, which they were very critical of. But even though the Hebraic thesis strikes our modern ears as strange, it was perfectly in keeping with structures of reasoned discourse in the 17th century. The Asiatic theory operated under the guise of empiricism for Jefferson and for Barton to replace one supervening ideology with another. Both myths of American origins functioned to ensconce Indians within a primitive past and to predict the rise of the new nation as an index of that past. Origins myths thus helped to legitimize the Anglo presence within the New World and to account for contemporary narratives of extinction. Yet even as Enlightenment contrast between the civilized and the primitive relegated the Indians to an ancient and unrecoverable past, notions of the sacred power of indigenous words persisted in American literature. In his History of American Indians, published in 1775, the Irish Indian trader and self-taught linguist James Adair claimed to hear within Chickasaw, quote, a completion of the manifestations of God's infinite wisdom and power. According to Adair, nature exudes a sense of divine worship in Chickasaw. For the American Indian conception of God exists in smoke, fire, and clouds. The sound of divinity comes through Chickasaw like music or poetry. In his view of the climate and the soil of the United States, published in 1804, the Comte de Volney heard the same mystical wholeness in Miami. Volney compared Miami to the Miami verse to the songs of the bards Ossian and Homer, and mapped sonic links between Miami, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew. Written with the goal of encoding a renewable Eden in the very structure of an indigenous tongue, Volney describes Miami as regenerative. From it, the divine art of poetry could be created for the present age. Such valuation of the imaginative and regenerative potential of Indian words emerged as aesthetic compensation for the political reality of the United States and Indian affairs at the turn of the 19th century. Indian languages allowed statesmen, natural philosophers, novelists, and poets to construct a story of the land from antiquity to present in order to assuage the trauma of a young nation whose sovereignty was irreparably fractured due to the competing land claims of American Indian tribes. In the early Republic and antebellum periods, the confrontation with this difficult reality of fractured sovereignty engendered a literary project of national mourning that would buttress the state's inadequate methods of reasoned discourse as an avenue to power. So recall throughout The Last of the Mohicans how James Fenimore Cooper compares the corrupt language of English and French to that of the Delaware. Cooper uses Moravian missionary John Heckewelder's commentary on the metaphysical capacity of Indian languages as his source text. He juxtaposes the stunted speech of Natty Bumppo, Hawkeye in this particular novel, with the cadence of the Delaware, which the narrator then emulates. The landscape has a lyrical quality, consisting of sounds that must be heard to be known, and a music that needs a language to be understood. Still, secret, and secluded, the land is, quote, interrupted only by the low voices of men, the occasional and lazy tap of a woodpecker, the discordant cry of some gaudy jay, or a swelling on the ear from the dull roar of a distant waterfall. A novel in which violence, death, and rebirth are cyclical, the language of the Delaware, as it gets absorbed into the cadence of Cooper's own attempt to forge a uniquely American literary voice, survives as a tenuous link between America's past and its future. In Cooper, we bear witness to human sacrifice, death, generation, and regeneration. Indigenous languages forecast a grand narrative of national rebirth with prophetic certainty. The Indian word is the sign that makes the world of nature flesh for future generations. For other antebellum writers, the American Indian presence haunts and lingers more emphatically, refusing to leave a landscape that is itself infused with Indian words. As Lydia Sigourney asks at the beginning of her poem, Indian Names, how can the red man be forgotten while so many of our states and territories, bays, lakes, and rivers are indelibly stamped by names of their giving? The question is, of course, rhetorical, as Sigourney goes on to explain, and this is quoted on your handout. I'll just read part of it. Their memory liveth on your hills, their baptism on your shore, your everlasting rivers speak their dialect of yore. The sense of language is being encoded in the landscape. A landscape of forgotten ghosts of the past also haunts William Cullen Bryant's poem, The Prairies. Just the three lines at the bottom of that very long passage, which I included just for your reference. The mound builders vanished from the earth, the solitude of centuries untold has settled where they dwelt. So the mounds that the speaker is viewing during this poem animate the poem. They give form to an eerie, empty stillness. Listening to his steed's gallop, the speaker notes, quote, the hollow beating of his footsteps seems a sacrilegious sound. The mounds recall the race that long has passed away, and the speaker reflects upon those whose rest he tramples. What was once is now nothing more than, quote, a forgotten language and old tunes from instruments of unremembered form. The wind remembers the forgotten language, the prairie wolf hunting in the fields, the gopher mining in the ground, the vultures on top of the uncovered sepulchres, insects, and birds that scarce have learned the fear of man, all remember the forms of the races that have long passed. Amid this remembrance of forms, on a prairie quick with life, the speaker, however, finds that he is in the wilderness alone. So the final line of The Prairies, I am in the wilderness alone, the speaker finds himself without a map, without the Indian guide and Abenaki dictionary that led Thoreau in the Maine woods, without the transparent eyeball of Emerson's Bare Common. He finds himself only faintly aware of the forms and ghosts emanating from the palimpsestic layers of civilization to come before. The past is an ambiguous temporal marker in the poem. It is as ancient as the Greek, but it is also inexact, a series of unremembered forms. The solitude of centuries untold are cyclical. Thus change the forms of being, the speaker tells us. So from the indelible Indian names in Sigourney's poem to the forgotten language of Bryant's, Indigenous words linked the American literary present to the Indigenous past. Cast at once as prophetic and primitive, the rhetorical rendering of the Indian in Cooper strives to efface a Native American present. Indigenous words resist this effacement. As the native philosopher Viola Cordova writes, American Indian languages stem from a sense of bounded space, where the entire cosmology is land-based. Lakota writer Delphine Redshirt explains, there are words in Lakota that are used to describe things which have been part of our lives since time began. Or the storytelling grandmother in N. Scott Momaday's House of Dawn could have whole and consummate being in words and language only. Resurfacing in American literary history time and again, Indigenous words show that the myths of Indian origin and extinction were not only ineffective, but flawed from their inception. For the complex and multifarious civilizations that preceded the rise of U.S. nationalism continuously reappear as inextricably bound to the land and therefore as integral to the meaning of America. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you all for coming. Now, my talk is very broad. It's kind of a state of the field overview, and also takes a look into the future. And I'm afraid it's kind of a manifesto. So here it goes. Native American history is ancient, and it has a complex root system. It began thousands of years ago when first peoples appeared in the Western Hemisphere and started to pass on stories of their experiences. That indigenous tradition continues today. Another tradition in the practice of recording Native American history began more recently, about 500 years ago. And it began when Western Europeans began to write about the indigenous peoples they encountered in the Americas, projecting their fears and fantasies on their subjects who would have struggled to recognize themselves in the portrayals. This tradition, too, continues today. And professional scholarship has disentangled from it with considerable difficulty. Once embedded in the popular consciousness, stereotypes and misconceptions are hard to shake off. Indeed, a decisive break did not come until the late 20th century, with the rise of the new Indian history, which drew on the ethno-historical methodologies to cut closer to native realities. Now, New Indian history is old now. Its name evoked rarely, except in historiographical overviews like this one. Yet, its sensibilities inform much of the current scholarship. We live and work in its long shadow. So in contemplating the futures of Native American history, I think it's important to recall these multiple origins, for they are part of the field's present and will be part of its future. New Indian history placed indigenous peoples at the center of things, hoping to recast the old master narrative of America that locked native people on the wrong side of modernity. It has been widely successful. The last quarter century has seen a succession of groundbreaking studies that have changed American history almost beyond recognition. Early American history, where the impact of New Indian history has been strongest, has experienced what one scholar recently called an indigenous turn. This turn coincides with several other turns: cultural, continental, and environmental, with the result that early America now looks almost nothing like it did just 2 decades ago. Gone is the trivialization of Native Americans as myopic, pre-political actors, mere speed bumps in Anglo-America's westward expansion. And gone is the reduction of hundreds of indigenous communities to a hazy backdrop of frontier hostility. Rather than a monolithic preordained sequence, the creation of America is now seen as a multilateral process that created new worlds for all. Native American history has come into its own, and it has expanded far beyond its traditional confines. It has penetrated deeply into American history, reshaping its contours from race relations, slavery, and religion to settlement patterns, nation building, and constitutional history. Native American history, in short, has entered and become the mainstream. For many, this is a cause for concern. The ascendancy of Native American history has been so forceful that many fear that the field is running out of steam, having exhausted its creative momentum. Such concerns reflect in part the anxieties of scholars who set out to decenter American history and suddenly found themselves their once marginal field at the very center of things. Many see mainstream as a corrupted place for this subversive field, fearing that it will grow complacent, soft, and lazy. I, for one, don't think so. Native American history is the mainstream now, and it is there, in the mainstream, where it will flourish. Tightly intertwined with borderlands, environmental, and imperial histories, Native American history will continue to reshape the contours of American history. Building on an already substantial body of scholarship, new studies will elucidate the roles and meanings of gender, race, sexuality, intermarriage, slavery, and empire in Indian settler relations. Increasingly, moreover, new studies will actually sidestep the Europeans, focusing instead on Indian relations, an entire subfield that's only now starting to take shape. We will learn about previously obscured indigenous borders and centers, and we will bend our representations of colonial and early national realms around them. We will continue to debate how native or colonial early American really was, and whether resistance or accommodation defined its course. And yet, some concerns about the futures of Native American history are well warranted. Embedded in the mainstream, the field is dissolving into broader historiographical currents, gradually saturating them. This may mark the ultimate triumph of New Indian history, but it's a success laced with uncertainty. When subfields become the new orthodoxies, they do tend to stiffen and become reactionary. And this is a particular concern for Native American history, which together along with the African American history has become something of a moral touchstone of American history, deeply critical of its last half millennium. There are, however, inbuilt dynamics and new developments that will help the field to retain its critical and subversive edge. Some of these dynamics stem from the Native society's changing position in today's United States. During the last 2 decades, many Native communities have experienced dramatic revivals. They have rebuilt economies through lobbying, resource development, and gaming. And they have built schools, houses, hospitals, and cultural centers. They have fought for federal recognition, and they have asserted treaty rights in courts. This has implications on scholarship. Stronger communities have translated into stronger voices. Native intellectuals are becoming more vocal, and growing numbers of Native peoples are entering graduate schools and faculties. Together, these developments pose compelling challenges to the practice of Native American history. Some Native thinkers demand that Native people should write their own histories and decide how and if their history should be disseminated to wider audiences. They want to reclaim their histories from the snares of scholarly and media misrepresentation, and they insist that academic research should empower indigenous communities. Historians, they demand, may prefer to have their sources dead, but they must acknowledge that their research has present-day political implications. Some see an unbridgeable divide between oral traditions and archive-based documentation, and they assert the primacy of the former, arguing that Native stories extend deeper in time and get closer to the essence of indigenous experiences. Native American history, in short, has become a contested ground where debates about the politics of knowledge production, intellectual gatekeeping, and the ownership of the past simmer. The controversies will continue, I'm sure, but scholarly common grounds will emerge. In fact, they already have. Both native and non-native writers have started to produce studies that narrow the gap between established academic practices and indigenous expectations, pushing Native American history in new directions. Scholars now write directly about the pain and psychological trauma of Native peoples, sensitizing us to the human dimensions of racism and dispossession, and forcing us to come to terms with the pervasive violence of American history. They have started to write about such neglected topics as Native American-African American relations, and such divisive ones as the enslavement of African people by native people. They explore the complex linkages among Indian removals, Indian reservations, and US constitutional history. And they probe how native peoples have resisted, survived, and exploited assimilationist federal programs. Terms like ethnic cleansing, extermination, cultural genocide, and historical memory are now entering the scholarship with unprecedented theoretical vigor. New studies are also challenging the tidy periodization of American history into pre-contact, colonial, and national periods. They do so by showing how deep-rooted indigenous practices survived to shape colonial policies, and by showing how the legacies and the very practices of colonialism continue in the present. Indeed, new studies are pulling Native American history from early America closer to the present, where the field can respond more directly to the needs and concerns of indigenous communities. The lines of research are multiplying and diversifying. Such established topics as native-settler relations and the biological consequences of European colonialism will continue to thrive, but they will connect with a multitude of new topics. Native struggles for self-determination in what is essentially a para-colonial situation. Affirmations of native identity through political activism, cultural preservation, repatriation, language revitalization, spiritual movements, and mobility. The rise of pan-Indianism and modern Indian nations and the related reconfiguration of national, state, and tribal relations. The connections between the decline of keystone species and indigenous self-determination. The division of Indian tribes into haves and have-nots. These and many other emergent lines of research are now realigning Native American history, and they will alter how we understand multiculturalism, democracy, sovereignty, and the role of the nation-state in modern American society. Now, these are global issues, and they are pulling Native American history into the world. For some time now, scholars, intellectuals, and activists across the world have engaged in transnational conversations about indigenous issues. The establishment of NISA, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, in 2008 integrated those efforts by providing a broad interdisciplinary platform for global indigenous studies and discussions. There is now an emergent field of comparative indigenous scholarship that is gathering momentum. It is exemplified by innovative studies that have traced, among other topics, treaty-making processes in New Zealand and United States, indigenous diasporas across the Pacific and Atlantic rims, and the forced removal of indigenous children into state institutions in Australia and the United States. It is already clear that one of the futures of Native American history will be comparative and transnational. And if the recent studies I have any indication, that future is secure and bright. Thank you.
Well, two terrific papers there, and there are plenty of points that I'm sure we'll all want to take up from both of them. Bevan asked me to just give a sort of a little bit more of an overview about American studies and where it might fit in American studies as a way into this. Then we'll, have some very specific questions for the two speakers. The field of Native American studies has opened up hugely in relatively short periods of time. I want to go slightly further back than where Pekka started in some senses, but really with we can go back almost as far as D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Find Dolores Costa Died for Your Sins, variety of things like Francis Jennings' book, all of which, in a sense, drew attention to something that had been ignored. And the whole, it seems to me that the effect of Native American studies, the first big impact of it, was in a way of filling in of a great big gap. There was a sense in which American history and American culture had effaced and ignored and suppressed histories, voices, agents and agencies. And so there's a massive influence to revise American history, American literature and the canon, and include. So the big impulse in many ways was just about finding masses of stuff. So huge amounts of material were found, just at the very basic level, were explored, were filled into the gap. And the reason for this was that the narrative, which was all of civilization, bringing civilization to the natives and so on, was reversed. It was very exemplified really by Francis Jennings' book, published in the early 70s, which was, the title was The Invasion of America, you know, not the civilization of America, but the invasion of America. And the subtitle made it even clear, Colonialism and the Cant of Conquest. This ruffled a few feathers early on, straight away. But at this period, you know, what you get was a great deal of attention paid and a great deal of information. Literary texts were found that were not available, not known about before. Stories of theft and violence and all the rest of it were increasingly made available. So at one level, what was going on here was an inclusion of what had been ignored into a national narrative. And that was in itself a very important activity. But it was still an activity which was an inclusion into the national narrative of America. I should say here, we're talking about America. I'm very aware of Canadianists in the audience, and I'm sure they'll be transposing their own version onto this, and I'm sure we'll have some questions maybe about it. But what we have is an inclusion into the narrative of America. Now this had, it seems to me, undoubtedly hugely beneficial effects. And just in the period, it's a long period that I've been involved in this, it's seen a massive change in the availability, particularly, say, an interesting case would be New England, where a huge number of, it turns out, Native American writing, which, you know, first of all, people thought there wasn't much of, turns out to be not only is there a huge amount of it, but it's in New England where everybody thought Native Americans had disappeared anyway, so you've got a double sense of their presence and the presence of the writing band. So we have this inclusion into a national narrative, but of course this is really only the first stage and only half of the thing, because the crucial point is that once you start including this material into the national narrative, it questions the national narrative itself, and also it questions the methodologies by which you can recognize it. Oh, well, let's look for American Indian literature. Well, you won't find much. If you change your scope and say, let's look at Native American writing, let's look at the languages, let's look at so on, you find an awful lot of things which vary your sense of what literature was anyway, and what Native American writing meant. Similarly, at the level of American history, we have obviously not just, as Francis Jennings would be doing, looking at Native and Puritan, looking at Puritan texts to see what hypocrites they all were, but you have ethnohistory, which starts to use a wholly different set of materials to look at, to supplement what was counted as American history. And I'm using the word supplement in a sense, in the Derridian sense of it, meaning, you know, you supplement, you add to, but you also replace that supplement, that idea of doubleness. Replacing. So at some level, you're including, you're swallowing into the national narrative. But what you swallow actually causes indigestion. What you swallow causes a problem. The national narrative doesn't fit anymore. And both the speakers here have written books which exemplify this in all sorts of ways. Pekka's book, The Comanche Empire, is actually a brilliant book which I think anyone who's read it has to see their view of American, as certainly the Southwest changed. But what happens there is that by calling the book The Comanche Empire, a deliberately provocative term in all sorts of ways, it makes us think about the ways in which people occupy land, what it means to have power, And we have to think of a completely different sense of politics and of power and so on, which allow us to see, he shows us, that there was a huge force operating, a huge entity operating, which was sort of invisible if you didn't look in the right way. Similarly, Sarah's work, Science of the Soul, opens up by just connecting up with European Enlightenment, and again by concentrating on language, allows us completely, like me anyway, a real eye-opener of a period that I thought I knew. So in these ways, the field itself included, but the inclusion becomes problematic. I was thinking of a phrase by the movie mogul Sam Goldwyn, who famous for phrases like a verbal contract's not worth the paper it's written on, and in 2 words, impossible. And he was always full of these sort of phrases. And at one stage when he was looking at a contract, he said that he didn't like this contract. He said, include me out, which is a nonsense term. But actually it's a very useful term, I think, include me out. It's a bit like I would prefer not to. It's a sort of negative thing. And in a way, it seems to me the stance, the thing that starts to grow because of the emphasis on indigeneity is a business of including out. Because the emphasis on the indigenous, the emphasis on taking seriously the claims of indigeneity, really present profound questions about inclusion. Because by claiming to be indigenous peoples, by the claims of indigeneity are actually quite provocative to the idea of inclusion. Because by emphasizing indigeneity, you are in fact emphasizing we were here first, we don't fit within the national narrative in any sense, the claims we make are based on things that are not accepted in America anymore, like blood and priority and authenticity. So in a funny way, indigeneity sets itself against, claims for indigeneity set themselves against not only the older ideas of America, but actually all of the many of these sort of post-structuralist and post-colonial narratives. So the claims for indigeneity are in a very uneasy relation to a lot of political theory, a lot of post-colonial theory, and so on. Because whereas post-colonial theory and so on is talking about constructedness and effectiveness and borders and margins and so on, in a sense, one of the arguments about indigeneity is exactly the opposite of that. It's sort of deliberately flirting, taking seriously essentialism, it's taking seriously the idea of priority and so on. So in some ways, indigeneity is the least easy thing to fit in, to be included. Because indigenous peoples literally do say, include me out to America. They're unlike any other group in America. They don't want rights. They don't want the same rights as every other American. They already have prior rights in all sorts of ways. So indigeneity presents a really interesting problem. In some sense, indigeneity is more post-structuralist, I think, in some ways, because it's sort of like queer theory. It doesn't fit. It deliberately is out in all sorts of ways. And both of these, a great deal of the recent work seems to me to be trying to deal with exactly that claim. The claims for a certain sort of, the claims that go with indigeneity, and yet, in a sense, how do we fit this into, if you like, what Pekka talked about, mainstream, in a sense. So they're the sort of, the drift of the thing, it seems to me. In literary terms, in American literature, in terms of Native American literature, I think the arguments about indigeneity have been particularly strong, particularly well ventilated anyway, let's say. Maybe now it's a point of diminishing returns, I think, but it certainly has been very strongly argued, where we get, again, just as, if you like, the larger claims of Native Americans were about include me out. So, in a sense, we have, in the case of indigenous writing, an argument, do we want to be part of a canon? Do we want to be part of the mainstream of anything? Well, at one level, of course, you can say Indigenous writing is specifically different from American writing. We just have two things. We have, Anglo, Sioux writing, or also traditions, oral histories, and so on, and we have American writing. But of course, we do have the problem that most Native American writers write in English, and we come back to this question of native languages and survival and so on. So you get a figure like the Ojibwe writer David Troyer writing and arguing that, in fact, when Leslie Martin Silko writes in English in a novel form, in a form of a novel that's very like a late modernist novel, she's at least as much in a tradition of D.H. Lawrence. She writes about nature, for instance, as she is in a Laguna Pueblo relation. And that seems to be, in a sense, inarguable in one way, but is a really problematic question, and has been, very fiercely debated, because it seems, in some sense, to be including her into the canon, into wanting to say she's just like a T.S. Eliot or something of this sort. So that question of, this is the question I'm speculating, you can see I'm hammering on about inclusion, exclusion, including how much do Native Americans want to be, need to be, inevitably are included in a national narrative. How much can they almost reverse the national narrative on their own? I was taken by what Pekka said when he said, it is mainstream. And maybe I could start by asking some questions and so on, and bring people in here. I mean, perhaps I could just start with that point that you made in the paper there. I wasn't clear when you said Native American history now is mainstream, is the mainstream, I think you said. Whether you meant that in a sense it was, well, perhaps you could explain a little bit more.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, thank you. What I should qualify a little, when I said it, Native American history being in the mainstream, I really sort of mean early America, perhaps in the early 19th century America. It has sort of a chronological limitation. So, what I really mean by this is, the thing, I mentioned indigenous turn, and how Native American history is, I mean, these days it's extremely difficult to write on any topic in Native American history, any topic without including Native peoples. So that's a major change. And if you just look at the number of studies pouring out every year, on early America and 19th century America, it's just astounding, And these are books, many of these books were last, starting with Richard White's Middle Ground to the present. These are, like you said, these are works that not only kind of try to fill the gap in the national narrative, but they actually try to revise, very deliberately, the traditional Eurocentric, frontier-centric or nation-centric narrative. And they've been quite successful. So this is what I mean by the indigenous term and Native American history being in the mainstream. It's accepted. It's the norm. You have to any historian sort of neglects indigenous topics, perspectives of their own peril. That said, I also mentioned, NISA and these new kinds of debates, and this is where I think the field is really diverging in some ways, and I mentioned how mainstream is uncomfortable, and many indigenous people feel exactly that. It's a dangerous place. You may think you are revising the national narrative, but in the sense you're still part of it, and you are debating on those traditional terms, etc., exactly the things you were talking about, and in the end, you're being absorbed into these epistemological and cultural conventions. So NASA is, how many of you heard about NASA? It hasn't, it's 5 years old, right? But this is a kind of movement, it's about ingenuity and very kind of openly political association that really is in many ways, it takes genocide seriously. it takes, you know, extermination, these kind of topics seriously. And in many ways, it is an attempt to really step outside, you know, of this kind of mainstreaming that's taking place. It's a very, you know, fraught situation moment, I think, in American history, especially, you know, in these days, you know, how to relate, how to be in the mainstream, you know, should we step outside?
Then just follow up, just on that question, but you talk about the complexities of dealing with oral traditions, indigenous traditions in the archive, the written archive. And you suggesting there's a lot more work that although there was a problem, it was a problem that was solvable to some extent, or at least compromises were made there. I mean, did you find that in your own work, or could you point to other people where you think it's not been resolved yet?
Well, you know, I mean, I felt, you know, my work is you know, sort of very much on that mainstream effort, you know. I mean, it's in the very title of my book, you know, using a kind of a non-indigenous term to describe an indigenous social organization. So, and but at the same time, you know, we do have, you know, in the Emeritus, the Michael Wittgen's book organizers came out 2 years ago, Infinity of Nations, focusing on the Great Lakes. It's very much kind of a different sort of approach, you know. It really embeds the whole story, whole narrative in indigenous concepts of time, belonging, self-understanding, etc. So, you know, I think what we have really is this, you know, interesting moment again where, you know, you do have, you know, very sort of diverging approach, you know, methodologically and conceptually and so forth.
Just seems the question of how much weight you give to orality is important, and obviously it comes up with Sarah's material, and I wondered how much of the mystique around the idea of the native word, the indigenous word, or whatever I want to say, has to do. I mean, you know, fitted very. I can see exactly how you were using it, and the idea of a language being saved from extinction, and even if the language isn't saved from extinction, in a funny way, the words are individually and resonating in a strange sort of way on their own. But it's a very dangerous sort of area, as I think you quoted from somebody who was making very cautious remarks about it. I wondered if you shared that worry that there was a romanticization of or at least was it wishful? How much wishful thinking is involved in the idea of indigenous survivance of a language, meaning cultural survival as well.
Right, yeah. And it is sort of dangerous territory. I know what you mean, because it's always, it's often both at the same time. And so throughout all of the kind of take the early literature that I was talking about, the Jesuits, for example. So the Jesuits, among all of the missionaries, were the best linguists. They were better than the Puritans with linguistics. And they did, often, they would come to the New World, and they would say these languages are savage and they're barbaric and be very disparaging. And then after living with a particular tribe, and they would stay with sort of one tribe for decades, they would shift their perspective and say, actually, this language is really beautiful. It has all of these sort of metaphoric possibilities and so on. And so there is a real kind of shift in thinking that I think does strongly impact the record that we have. That part of the reason why in Gravia's dictionary, I mean, it's impossible not to see that as a kind of remarkable piece of linguistic work. It's impossible not to read it as a text that was produced by someone who had tremendous respect for the language, even though at the same time he was engaged in helping the French to win the imperial wars and all of these other efforts. And so there's a real kind of, I don't know if it's quite a double-edged sword, but there's a real kind of like complexity of the relationship to the language that's being preserved and kind of celebrated on a certain level, and also culturally destroyed on another level. So it's complicated in those early texts where there's that first encounter. And the second part of I think what you're asking is in terms of survival, and it's I mean, I want to try to Obviously, with time constraints, my readings at the end were very quick. It's not so much that some of the mainstream writers, Cooper and Bryant and so on, were attentive to these historical complexities. There's a great deal of romanticization going on. At the same time, I feel in my own disciplines, particularly American literary studies, where there's actually been a very strong trend to move away from a national telos, to move away from Perry Miller, from Berkovich, and move away from telling a story about kind of coherent national identity in favor of a different approach, a transatlantic, a hemispheric, and so on. And I actually think that the national narrative itself we should revisit precisely for this reason, because at the same time that there's a romanticization going on, there's also a real sense among these writers of an anxiety about fractured sovereignty, of kind of how to sort of aesthetically and politically grapple with the presence of Native Americans on the American frontier and what that question means for the early U.S. and also for literary history at that moment. So I don't know if that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe I could open it up to questions. I've got more, but I don't want to hog it through. But do you really like to keep us off today? Yeah, Matthew.
This is a question, Sarah, maybe to follow on from Dave's point. I'm kind of interested in this question of mediation. You mentioned the work of Matt Cohen and so forth, kind of dealing with the study of media and mediascape. And it strikes me here, just in the images you present, there's this movement from manuscript to print to the internet at the end, which is kind of embedding this printed image within it. And I'm wondering how that fits with this kind of question of a potential romanticisation of language. Is there a kind of perception that the words aren't changing here, or how is those different media forms affecting that? Because at one point you mentioned this idea of language being perceived as porous and vulnerable.
So is it two questions? On the one hand, how does mediation affect what I'm saying about the romanticization of the words? And on the other hand, where does the sense of language as fixed come from? Or are they? Yeah,
that's probably a better way of articulating.
I was just trying to get. So the sense of where does language as fixed come from? I think that it comes from a sort of I don't want to be critical of language recovery programs at all. Like, they're doing amazing work, but there is a sense of a kind of way of recuperating something from the past that I'm not sure is actually recuperable in that way. And so what I want to say is exactly your question, is that we need to attend more as early American scholars, as scholars of Native American studies, to the way that mediation might have affected these languages. I'm certainly not a linguist, so I can't do that sort of work, but just attending to how the kind of perspective of a missionary, the theological perspective, or the political goals of Jefferson when he collected his Indian vocabularies, he's after a very particular thing. And so he gives instructions for, say, orthography. So there's an idea of orthography, there's an idea of how the words are meant to be recorded. And I think that attending to those questions of mediation, how things were written down, the reason that they were written down, gets us past this sense of the languages as kind of fixed and these sort of fragments that we can recover and bring into the present. But I think that takes the work of people like Cohen to really tease out how mediation was impacting the act of transcription.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much, both of you. Fantastic. For Sarah, I was just wondering if it's possible to extend the way you're theorising the presence of Indigenous words in Anglo-American literature to look at perhaps former Anglo-American literature. Because looking at the two poems that you provide, in the Sigourney, the final phrase, your everlasting rivers speak their dialectic of you, and in the Bryant, and in the dust of these fair solitudes once stir with life. It seems that on the one hand there's pathetic fallacy here, on the other there might be an allusion to the ontological principles you're talking about of objects being animate and inanimate. And am I overreading that? Is it just pathetic fallacy, or is there perhaps a relationship?
That's great. So you're asking, is there actually a fascination with that potential power of words?
Is that particular kind of facet of native linguistic identity kind of, does that bleed into mainstream white Anglo-American literature as well?
I love that question. I want to say that it does. I mean, this is kind of like what we see in Brian in particular, and Sigourney as well. It's kind of like the Wordsworth thing in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. You know, this idea of language as having degenerated over time, but close. If you can capture something of a sort of folk language and transform it through poetry, you can get to this sort of sense of an language as it was, when this semiotic connection to some kind of invisible being was more palpably present within the words itself. So I definitely want to suggest something along these lines with these American writers, that there's a version of that operating within American poetics at the time. That's comparable, but that's different because it's also a recourse to an indigenous language, and that has a very different kind of valence than the Wordsworth thing. Thank you.
Can I just add a side part to that? It gets interesting though when, for instance, Pauline Johnson or a later Native American writer writes in this style, presenting herself as being a natural child, a child of nature and speaking from nature and so on, but using romantic language that she's acquired in learning English and reading the English canon. It's the same critique as David Troyer makes of later writers, where he's saying, well, you know, who's to say when you use a pathetic fallacy, when you're borrowing this because you've read Wordsworth or you've read D.H. Lawrence or somebody else, or it's in your blood, and you get desperately worrying territory when people start saying it's because I naturally do that because I'm a not so quite say that, but you know that it's a really complicated issue, I think, of language anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, it gets back to your point about including out.
Yeah.
You know, these are overlapping spheres of literary production. They're doing overlapping kinds of thing with language, and so kind of where do you draw that distinction?
One here and then one there.
I don't know if this is a question or what, but what I'm studying is the labor movement in the late 19th century United States. And this is what, in the midst of where, you know, the taking of the land from the Plains Indians is going on to a degree that nobody could ignore. And yet, what you discover is that's exactly what people do. Henry George, right, this whole theory of the land has been stolen from the people by the monopolists. Now, who are these people? Well, they're not the Native American people, and this is right in the midst of this. Even one of the few labor leaders that I've run across who's actually part Native American and takes pride in it, speaks the language of his grandmother and all of this. Even he, as far as I've read a lot of what he's written and said, even he never mentions this. So I guess, I don't know, my question is, you know, more like, well, how do we bring Native American history into this in a sort of clearer way than anybody has? Very general question, I'm sorry.
No, well, I guess you're talking into what exactly? How do we bring? Well, you're talking about the silences.
Yes.
Yes. That's it. That's great.
It's not silent as an issue generally, but it is among.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is, I mean, you still have, these glaring blind spots in the American history, which is one is, exactly what you were talking about, late 19th century. There's few historians have ventured there, and it's not at all as intensely studied as perhaps earlier periods. But how to rectify that? Oral histories, they do go back, and that's one way to historical memory. There's more and more research on these kind of issues. So and we are asking new kinds of questions. One of the big developments in Indigenous history, as elsewhere, is this question of sovereignty. And we are, really trying to start to question thinking, what sovereignty means, where is it located, where can you find sovereignty? We are starting to ask about these kinds of questions about, these sort of categories we take for granted, and this will help. These questions will help. They will illuminate these blind spots or these dark spots in history. I mean, these are, the Dawes Act, what you're talking about, I think with the current focus on sovereignty, space, belonging, and citizenship, etc., we will get there. I'm confident, but we are not there yet.
So why is that? The archive is an absence of a particular kind of archival material, or what? Or is it because it doesn't fit within a particular trend? What causes certain parts of the story to be left out?
Well, I think there's a disruption in the I mean, there are different kinds of sources we have from, say, colonial period, when the Spanish or the French or even the British are dealing with indigenous peoples pretty much on equal basis, and when the state power is really penetrates, indigenous communities in the late 19th century, the indigenous voices do disappear. They do disappear, and it's really difficult to retrieve them in a way historians have been able to for colonial periods. So I think there is, there are fundamental methodological problems. There's in particular this period, when the state power is asserted in the late 19th century, early 20th century, then it gets better. As 20th century proceeds and indigenous sovereignty is reasserted. But it's a good question, those kinds of massive methodological problems the field faces.
I think also that what the question is pointing to, reminding us of, is the power of ideological blindness, the power of people who actually were descended and did believe in it and actually could have found out more. Some of this information was in plain view, so to speak, but it's the ideological blindness. And I've been in the sort of an academic long enough to know that just in the time I've been teaching, when I started to teach, I taught classes which I would be terrified now. I mean, I was saying things like, of course there is no African American literature before such and such, there is no Native American literature. And I was saying this because somebody had told me it, and because I'd not found out any better, but also because there was a mindset which, I subscribe to, and it changes, but it takes a very long time to change, it seems to me. And it's, information can be found, but the ideological ability to ignore the information is just as powerful, I think. You need two things to change. One is you need to change the narrative, and then you can see the stuff that's actually there. And I think that has happened to a large extent. I would hope your union leader would now see what was in front of him in a different way. Not so sure. There was a question further back. Oh, it's already been asked. Okay. Another? Yeah.
I want to pick on that point you made, Pekka, about as these things enter the mainstream more. And one of the things I've discussed with students in classes is how it affects their view of kind of the course of American history, just their understanding what America looks like. In particular, it was second years we looked at the first of the article about the transatlantic frontier. his argument that the least likely outcome of all that is that it will become part of the United States. And I asked them to draw a map of what they thought the US would look like alternatively. Shouldn't go very well. But they have to look at what America looked like. No, I'm being mixed. But I was just wondering how you think that will filter down perhaps to kind of elementary school textbooks, how this history will filter into the way non-academic Americans understand the course of American history, and how long that might take.
Well, so it's slowly and painfully, and so my daughter went to school. She started at in Santa Barbara, California, and the first day she comes home, she's like, Dad, I finally learned about Native Americans. They're big, scary monsters. It's 3 years ago. So it's uphill battle. I mean, these are they are mythical, most mythical stories. The part of the the mythic America, frontier America, all those things. So it changes slowly, and and I mean, there are limitations, to whether indigenous history is in the mainstream, but it's in particular kinds of mainstream. It's Native American history has never been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. That's because to win the Pulitzer Prize, the story has to have check it out. It has to have a happy ending. That's that. Every single Pulitzer Prize book has that. Indigenous history doesn't. I mean, at least that's the perception. And it tends to end in dispossession still, and loss of land, etc., etc. So it's in the academic mainstream, whether it's in the popular mainstream. I'm really, actually, to be honest, and I can tell you more personal stories. So the Comanche Empire, the book I wrote. It did fine, sold copies, etc. But then 2 years later, there's this other book by a journalist called The Empire of Summer Moon. Sold about 500,000 copies, and it's basically the same thesis I make. There's a Comanche Empire, but this person is arguing it's all about violence. It's all about India. It's an empire of savage Indians. Just killing, raping, destroying, etc., etc. And that's the story. People want it, and they are making that, turning that into Dances with Wolves kind of Hollywood product now. So I mean, there you have it. There's a huge disconnect with the academic discourse and the popular discourse, and. It's I don't think the American society has been sensitized to indigenous issues the way it has been sensitized to African American history and African American issues. It seems indigenous history is still kind of this place where anything goes. It's not it's not part of the present. Same way as African American issues. It's in the past. Say you can take liberties. So in that sense, I'm quite, pessimistic.
I think too. Also, I was thinking about the book. I was recently reading Blood Meridian, which is, I mean, as one of the problems is that it seems to me that when the story of the West is told as a story of brutality, the white people are presented as brutal. But the benchmark of brutality, it's a bit like the Heart of Darkness. It's like that when Europeans go bad, they go as bad as the natives. But the natives are always the end stop, so to speak. And that happened. So everybody reading that book would be, they probably, I hate to say it, probably sold more copies than Comanche Empire. But so there's a sort of you gain a bit and you lose a bit, but the end stop is still that somewhere. This idea of savagery. Just to take up your point about African American now, I wonder, because one of the things that strikes me, one of the things I was going to mention as a sort of an area of if you like, of blindness within indigeneity. It seems to me one of the problems about indigeneity is that it sustains the gap between African Americans and Native Americans, which has always been historically a very problematic area because of the lunacies of of American race categories, it's meant that you're either Indian or black, and you're either native or black. The blood quotients have all been very obstructive in these ways, and it has forced Native Americans at various periods to define themselves against being black, the most recent being the expulsion of the Cherokee freedmen from the Cherokee tribe, expelling black Cherokee from the tribe, from tribal status anyway. So, an unfortunate event by anybody's standards, but for all sorts of historical reasons. But one of the effects of indigeneity, as I was saying, it's setting itself against the national narrative in all sorts of ways of inclusion and mixedness. In many ways, it's a challenge to any form of multiculturalism, indigeneity. Jody Bird makes this point in Transit of Empire, which is very interesting on this whole idea of it being a challenge to the idea of multicultural inclusion. But indigeneity means setting themselves off against African Americans, because African Americans don't have any indigenous language, and in a way you could argue African Americans have a real dialogue between African American and Native Americans would be, I think, incredibly useful and productive in all sorts of ways, because African Americans are another group of being effaced and ignored and so on, but have a different relation to modernity and have a different resource, or at least they don't have the resource of blood or of indigeneity or whatever it happens to be. And that debate just doesn't happen. It never has happened. And I was working in that field, and I was really struck. There are thousands of books about Native Americans and thousands of books about African Americans, and a handful which deal with both groups. I mean, literally a handful, I think. And that's, as I say, because of the lunacies of race, of the racial divisions. But I think intellectually it would be very productive to have more. Whether it's true that African Americans, you think they've had more purchase, so to speak, than Native Americans in becoming part of the national narrative, in the same.
Oh, I think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I do think, many indigenous communities do distance themselves from, exactly from these kind of discussions of, African American and Native American overlap. Because at the beginning, I think, reflects the modern-day political concerns. The concerns of the African American community and indigenous communities, they are different kind of politics. Indigenous people want sovereignty, and that's what they want, obviously. So, I think there's a kind of a fear, if you move the discussion too much from sovereignty towards, race and discrimination, you sort of dilute those battles, which, over jurisdiction and sovereignty, etc., etc. I think there's a, and I think actually very, strategic and very rational reason to keep these, issues separate.
Yes, I can see why they do it, but it's also downchanged.
And and the indigenous peoples don't write these histories. It's white, it's Caucasian historians who are now writing about mixed families of red and white. That's one of the titles of a new book by Annie Gradle. And Claudia Sant has written extensively. They tend to be microhistories, though. They tend to be histories of families. Yeah. And that's kind of very kind of focused micro level entry into those kind of mixes, but it's we don't see it on a political or broader level.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Some more questions for Sarah, I think. I was just wondering how well you think Indigenous knowledge and language translates onto like a digital format and onto the internet, because I think that's quite a big movement.
I think it's the internet's opened up wonderful possibilities for that. I can think just off the top of my head a number of projects. In fact, if you go to archive.org, I don't know if you know that site, but the Gravier dictionary was put up in its entirety on archive.org months ago. And the John Carter Brown Library has probably the biggest collection of Indigenous language texts of any archive I can think of, particularly with the exception maybe of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. They've put all of their stuff on archive.org. So it's a really terrific resource because it's had the effect of making these resources available to the tribes and to the communities. The challenge, of course, is that it's very difficult often to read these texts for many reasons. They're fragile old manuscripts and so on. And so the digital archive has to be supplemented with linguistic work, like what the Miami Center is doing in Ohio and the Wampanoag revitalization. But good question, thanks.
At a more topical level, of course, it means that indigenous language radio stations and stuff is another way of keeping languages alive, isn't it? You know, just at that level. Any more questions?
I just wanted to come back, Dave, to your point about African Americans and Native Americans, and nobody really looking at that history of interaction. And the thing that also strikes me in some of the works particularly on the borderlands, is actually the mixing between different native peoples, particularly through practices of slavery, kinship, etc. And I wonder whether even that is a basis for beginning to move further out and perhaps looking at these histories of interaction. Does anybody sort of pick up on that and think, okay, we must look more broadly? You know, there is already a history of mixing there. You know, way before. You know, Europeans decided that they were going to come into the Americas. Is that something that's the basis for sort of looking? I mean, I'm interested in that as sort of thinking about Spanish and Native American interaction, particularly in Mexico, Texas, and particularly Peninsula's, for example. You know, how interesting they are as sort of figures in that sort of history of mixing interaction. I mean, I know we're working, it's obviously a different period, we're working with different concepts of race and ethnicity and labelling, but I just wondered whether lots of people are working on that.
There are quite a few people are, you know, and it's you know, much of that work is done in the borderlands context, you know, and you do have, you know, borderlands historians really, you know, very consciously moving beyond this sort of, you know, Indian white dichotomy and including, you know, other people, especially, you know, fugitive slaves in the maroon communities, etc., you know, and that links with new studies on mobility, you know, how borderlands are these, you know, really, you know, places of intersection points of multiple mobilities, for instance, you know, so there's quite a bit of, you know, good research, but it tends to be very local, tends to focus on the southwest and a little bit on Florida, you know, but then again, you know, historians are sort of moving from land-based studies to waterscapes, and you know, there's new studies on sort of like Black Indian Caribbean. You know, there's we have a student in Oxford. She's doing, you know, her dissertation exactly on this, and so you know, these, you know, categories are being, you know, revisited and interrogated. But these are niche studies. You know, I mean, they're talking about the overall impact. So you know, these are very academic. But it's you know, one small move at a time.
See, part of the problem also the monoglot nature of North American scholarship very much. I mean, thinking about Mexico and Brazil, you know, we have got, you know, countries with very interesting different mixes and different engagements with indigeneity. In Brazil, for instance, certainly, you know, where you do have in many ways the same ingredients but a completely different political setup or different cultural setup between the three. And in a sense, it's usually been one-way traffic. It seems to me, the intellectual movement, and the Brazilians will read the American stuff, but it's not so much the other way around, I think.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and you know, that's where, you know, I ended my talk with that sort of global, you know, transnational, and there's a lot of hope there, you know, and then, you know, American historians actually start, well, first of all, read theory again. You know, it's about time, I think, and actually, you know, and expose themselves to other historiographies. You know, the only way to break free from some of these inbuilt, you know, blind spots that people still carry.
Okay, any more? Or You have another? Okay, so we thank the speakers very much, and thank you.